where common sense meets enlightenment. Conversations around mind, body, and spirit. Each month, a group of wellness thought leaders assemble to discuss topics like rage, wisdom in the 21st century, our mental chatter, and how to build healthy relationships.
Good evening, wisdom seekers. You're listening to the Wisdom Track podcast from the British Association of Anger Management, or BAAM for short. The Wisdom Track is where we take a look at our core values of growing self-knowledge, honing emotional intelligence, and learning communication skills. Our next introductory evening, where you can get a flavour of one of our courses, plus pick up some fundamental skills, is on Thursday, March the 10th at 7 p.m. Plus, we have our next weekly 3-hour, 10-week course beginning on Tuesday, the 15th of March. And we've got an in-person group weekend course happening from the 25th to the 27th of March, just outside London. Again, you can head over to angermanage.co.uk under the courses section for more details about those. My name's Steve Beale. I'm a journalist who's undertaken the BAAM program. I'm here to introduce BAAM founder, the anger guru, Mike Fisher, and our US consultant and regular blog columnist, Craig Snake Bloomstrand. And they're going to talk about a radical new book about men's sexuality, one that can obviously be read by women as well. That's called Sexed. And we're going to be joined by its writer, Paul Abramowitz. Sexed is out now. You can get it on Amazon. And a couple of things to make very clear about it. Firstly, it's aimed at heterosexual men, straight men specifically. And it's not about topical matters like men's stuff like the incel movement or pickup artists or something like that. It's about regular guy sexuality as a whole and how we can improve our experience of sex and how that relates to the world in general. The book does touch upon a little bit of those topical matters I just mentioned, but what it aims to do over a very informative and well-written 800 pages, by the way, is move the overall conversation about male sexuality forward, tackle some areas that apply to all men but don't often get discussed, not in recent decades or perhaps ever even, and now maybe is the time to do it. Now, Sexed examines men's sex drive on a biological, emotional, and spiritual level, acknowledging what a potent urge it is, but suggesting how we can incorporate this energy into both our wider selves and society in healthier ways that might, and I quote, develop personal methods of inquiry into greater self-understanding, meaningful sex, and conscious relating. Because, as the author, Paul Abramowitz, says, for men, biology dictates not only our sexual reality, but our entire reality sexually. Now, you might be saying, fair enough, but what are this chap's credentials to tackle all this stuff? Well, Paul is terribly skilled in all kinds of areas. For a start, he's a pretty serious medical professional, a periodontist, and he's held professorships at the University of Pennsylvania and Temple University, which is in Pennsylvania as well. Actually, no, it's in Philadelphia. My bad. Do forgive me. But it was Paul's upbringing in a home where his late father was a gynaecologist and sex therapist. And plus, during his own involvement over about 14 years or so with the men's consciousness movement that alerted Paul to, and I quote, a disappeared conversation around heterosexual male sexuality and its impact on our sense of self-agency and overall well-being as men. Towards his late 40s, Paul was inspired to begin studying Eastern and later Western sexology, and subsequently opened a therapy even space for couples and individuals, where they worked in matters of sex and intimacy using Paul's own model of deep transformational sex therapy. Paul began writing sex soon after, and he says he wished he could have found something like that when he originally began seeking answers himself. Here he is in conversation with Mike and Snake.
Okay, so we're here today with Mike Fisher and myself, Snake Bloomstrand, and Paul Abramowitz to talk about sex, specifically male sexuality. Paul has completed a book that's a very comprehensive book on the physiology, biology, emotionality of male sexuality in the world right now. And our plan is to take some of the interesting threads and pull on them a little bit and see what comes out. Probably start out with a question, Paul. What was the impetus? What was the motive for writing this book?
Thank you, Snake. I have been fascinated with the silence around deeper conversations around sex and sexuality since I was a teenager. I grew up in a home where my dad was a gynaecologist, obstetrician, and sex therapist. When I got out into the world, I found the conversation went around the entertainment aspect of sex. I would say the distribution of conversation, which went towards the deeper aspects of what make us up as human beings, I found to be missing. I found a discrepancy between myself and my female partners as I went into my 20s and 30s. There were different callings towards intimacy, sex, connection. And then in my 40s, when I actually around the time that I met you, Snake, and you, Mike, and just prior to that, when I became involved in self-development work, these questions had become so amplified in me. So I listened with great care as to where they were being attended to. And with all the talk around mindfulness, awareness, and self-development, I didn't find much conversation, particularly for men or men doing the work around deeper conversations around sex and sexuality. And I found it rather odd, because I knew for myself that sex took up a lot of my mind space and a lot of my actioning towards at that time in my life. A lot of the sense I made of the world came through the portal of sex and sexuality. And I listened to other men's stories, and I found them to be along the same thread. So I guess I was looking for a book that I wrote, but I couldn't find it. And when I went to look for it, I bumped into other researchers who said, how come, now these were researchers in sex and sexuality and men and masculinity. And they said, well, how come there's nothing much out there around the heterosexual male? Because surely if we're doing therapy with heterosexual men, there are aspects of the way that they interpret the world, their relationship with women, the meaning they give sex, that will impact the emotions they bring into the therapy space. So there was a calling from that point of view. And that was really the foundational pull to have me explore a little bit more and to write something comprehensive about it.
Yeah, for the audience, Paul and Mike and I have known each other well over 25 years in many different venues, but we met doing men's workshops together. And so these narratives that Paul refers to, we've all had that same experience, is that there's only so many narratives that men tell. and they kind of line up at a certain point. I know one that was, I grew up in the Midwest, and sex certainly wasn't anything that anybody talked about other than to joke about or hunger for one way or another. But I know when I started sitting with other men and speaking with them about their experience, a big missing appeared for me. And that was at that point in time, I had 2 children and was completely disconnected from having had a part in creating them. I was having sex. The connection between having half of the mixture to create life on Earth had never entered my consciousness. And to this day, I regret that ignorance. I don't know that, culturally, there was no way around that for me at that point in time. But it hits into the big secret that we keep as men around sex. Many, many secrets. And one of them was that I was half of the recipe in creating my children and didn't get it, didn't understand, wasn't present for that moment in any particular way. And at 70, I'm not about to start over again, but I really wish that I had been present and conscious in creating life. So I think that's a good example of what gets missed. Certainly one that was poignant for me, but it's one of 100 things that get missed too.
I think you touch on a wonderful point there, Snake, and that is that Simone de Beauvoir, the feminist phenomenologist, writes about the woman's body being sacrificed to the species in a sense through birthing process, through menstruation, etc., and that men seem to get away scot-free. I agree with her on the first point. On the second point, I don't think we get away scot-free. I think that although sex is celebrated for us as men, I think that there's a huge disconnect between what sex is and where sex sits in our humanity. And as you're pointing to here, our role in the biological imperative of creating the next generation. And this disembodiment, I think, costs us on many different levels. You're talking about the one level of not being aware to the degree that your body is designed to be a reproductive contributor. So one of the central chapters in the book invites men to consider this piece of biological obviousness, which is that our bodies are designed as much for reproduction as a woman's body. It's just not that obvious because we cloak reproduction behind the word sex and entertainment. But when we are able to broaden the landscape of our understanding of the body that we live in, our consciousness around that starts to change. And then, of course, the woman that we're engaging with and how we view her body and her consciousness also has an opportunity to really blossom into new spaces.
Mm. Yeah, another piece that I've struggled with, or that I struggled with, was intimacy and sexuality had merged in my head. I hadn't discerned between the two. Mm-hmm. And so I had pretty superficial friendships with men at that point in time, and they began to deepen and become intimate relationships, not sexual, but intimate at a very deep level. And that helped me discern between sexuality and intimacy and allowed me a much broader range of intimacy. I began looking for it. But up until, probably my early 30s, intimacy was conflated with sexuality and limited by that in the same way. The same components within sex, vulnerability, generosity, so many different bits and pieces that come up. are perfectly applicable in non-sexual relationships, and I had never considered that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think your point of view is unique in any way, and certainly the caricatured heterosexual male, which is transcultural and transgenerational, transhistorical, sort of reveals the same thing that you're talking about. And for many men, as I've discovered for myself, but as we get on later in life, there is a calling and a curiosity towards, well, what does intimacy look like outside of penetrative sex? And how do I find that part of myself that can connect deeply with my woman? How do I begin to understand my sexual self a little bit differently than my pubescent sexual self? And I think that's where the transition begins to happen between the line of entertainment sexuality and transformational sex. Yeah.
Yeah, I found it interesting too, particularly the brain chemistry, which has fascinated me for years. But like you, women have an initiation built in through the process of pregnancy and birth, or just the menstrual cycle. Their bodies initiate them into a different state of being. And what you lay out in the book in terms of, the flood of testosterone that takes place, I've always kind of bemoaned the fact that boys need to find initiation outside themselves. The brain science tells you, no, it's going on all along, and we're not made aware of it in any particular way. Not that it would give a whole lot of comfort to be aware of it at 13 or 14, but understanding it is critical information.
I think so. And I wonder the difference it would make. And I hope some of this information makes it into, early education, and that boys can be made aware, look, you're going to begin to feel these, you're going to begin to experience these things. I think that there is a benefit to being alerted to what's on the horizon. And it's interesting that the neuropsychiatrist Luann Brizendine, who's written two remarkable books, The Male Brain and The Female Brain, points out that at age 9, a boy gets like a glass full of testosterone a day, and then by 15, like 7.5 liters of testosterone a day. So the marriage of social sciences and molecular biology, I think, would do well to find a place in our understanding of our lived experience as men. And we can't simply leave everything in the hands of social science, but we also don't want to become a biological fundamentalist, in essence, as Sapolsky points out. And I think there's great wisdom in the balance. And there are also, we can get into them a little later if you like, but there are also, as I pointed out, some significant brain changes that happen for us as we're going through these rushes towards masturbation and interest in the female form, which tend to emboss our point of view as we move into our 20s and 30s and 40s, and can delay us as men, keeping us in a rather pubescent state of sexual awareness. And so that's something I wanted to point out, that there is a way out of that through the awareness, which is both the biological and the emotional awareness of this incredible application, which is our body, I suppose, that we're living in.
Yeah. I mean, perhaps there's a parallel, not an exact parallel, but close, with women going through menopause. Their brain chemistry is changing dramatically. And the functions that were there for a lifetime are changing. Different chemicals are required. And so, in many ways, you see so many women struggle with the changes that take place in their bodies and in their minds. And, as boys, we're going through that at 9, 10, 11 years old. It's a lot to carry.
No, you're spot on. You're spot on. And of course, there's andropause too, where we reduce our testosterone and we go through our own changes, but perhaps it's far more dramatic, as you're pointing out, with women. Of course, one of the benefits is that when we go through this as older individuals, we've kind of got a toolkit to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
When we go through it in puberty, as young boys, there's an aspect of it that is a little bit like an ordeal, except that the ordeal is continually made pleasuresome. So it's a bit of a cognitive dissonance because we have the dopamine high, we have the orgasm, we have the seeking sexual opportunity. But I do point to puberty as a bit of an ordeal, as an initiatory process, as you will have read about. And to some degree, because the way society is set up, there's stage 3 of the initiation doesn't happen for everybody, which is like a homecoming. Mm-hmm. So many of us, I feel many of us are left kind of hovering out there in a sort of an in-between zone with regards to, well, how do we spend our sexuality that we've been given? How do we spend this incredible fuel in a way that we don't hurt anybody and we don't hurt ourselves, and we bring it into a place of mature masculinity? And I think that that's perhaps a common thread that all three of us have heard in the stories shared by incredible men over the years, is this fracture that happens between men's humanity and their sexuality, our humanity and our sexuality, and how do we up-level that to bring it to a place of the mature masculine.
Mm-hmm.
Let me, sorry, Snake, can I say something?
Yeah.
Or do you want to develop on that?
No, go ahead. I'll come back to it.
Listen, I'm listening very carefully to what's being said, and I think a lot of what you're describing somehow goes over my own head. I kind of grasp what is being said, and I can resonate with some of what is being said, but I've got a real curiosity, which is about the here and now within the context of men and sexuality. And we talk about the toxic male. We talk about the male without balls. But this conversation feels like what we're talking about. What does it mean to be a sexual man? Or if I just develop on it, a sexual being at this stage of life on this planet? Because it does feel like it for me, it raises questions around certainly social media, the accessibility to pornography, how even men today, and I want to include myself in that, are constantly chasing the orgasm, have a terror of intimacy, however we want to describe intimacy, and how do we change the mindset of, if I can include the word us men, in order to kind of recognize that there is something about the way that we relate to the opposite sex, which they themselves are tired of and also exhausted by, this idea of being objectified. And yet from a cultural perspective, women magazines are constantly reinforcing the objectification of women. And so there's something to be said, well, what does it mean to be a sexual man in this part of our particular century? And the book that you've written, where my curiosity lies, is one, how has that shaped your thinking? Because obviously you've done a lot of research, you've done a lot of reading, and you've given this a huge amount of thought. How has it shaped your perception? And how do you imagine it's going to shape the perception of very young boys, teenagers, young adult men, and, you know, men like myself, who's already in my early 60s or mid 60s, who has far more estrogen than testosterone. So it clashes with what I would describe as my own kind of stereotypical male position. And I'm not saying that. Yeah. And I'm not saying that my position is a comfortable position.
Yeah.
But I am saying that my position probably comes from a place of confusion, and also from a place of, you know, just to put it very bluntly, a place of controversy.
Well, thank you, Mike. That's a beautiful question, because for me it lands the conversation in the here and now. It also allows me to say that a lot of what you're saying is why I felt it was necessary to write the book, and certainly from my own research. I did not include the conversation of toxic masculinity because the conversation, there was enough to talk about what I call the men in the middle of the bell curve, which might be the three of us, which are the non-asexuals on the left of the asexuals on the left of the bell curve, and then the perpetrators, the erectile dysfunction and the medicalized men on the other side of the bell curve. And it seems like society had deemed that for the rest of us, everything was fine. And that wasn't what I was seeing. And it was certainly not what I was experiencing in my own life. So I would, you know, headline that how the rest got sexed, because it looks like society is really fascinated by these other sides of the bell curve. And my conversation I wanted to bring to the present moment for men for whom all is not 100% great, but there was no conversation to be found anywhere that I was looking. And certainly that was agreed to by the researchers in the sex field and in sort of Journal of Men and Masculinity. So that kind of gives a preface, and I want to sort of thank you for positioning you where you're at. I would say, and the way that I work with clients who want to make that move from that place of confusion, cognitive dissonance, objectification, to a place of what I call metasexual cognition, which is a more evolved or changed way of seeing themselves as human sexual beings, and therefore relating to their women in more evolved and different ways, where intimacy, communication can be included, is that it really does require a kind of self-determination, and it's a little bit like a martial art. And I say it's a martial art because, from my point of view, biology sets us on such a profound course of habitual sexuality for a whole number of reasons, which Snake will have read about, having read the book. We're all threaded through the same eye of the needle. And that eye of the needle starts at 7 weeks in utero, when we start getting the testosterone. So even at that point in time, that part of our brain that identifies a sexual opportunity through the form of a woman, which you have related to as objectification, begins to develop. And in our brain as men, according to Luann Brizendine, the neuropsychiatrist, it's 2.5 times bigger than a woman's brain. Now, that's helpful information for me. I can tell you it's helpful information for my clients, because if they know what they're working with, they can reduce the amount of shame and guilt and judgment, and they can look at that particular aspect, which I call avert alertness, which we've all experienced in ourselves. We can clock, within 180 degrees, something that looks interesting or opportunity at different times in our lives, obviously. That's just one example, Mike, to give you. And I can tell you that women who read chapter 4, which is the narratives of the 8 men who went through puberty, talking about guilt and shame and sex drive and family environment and vulnerability, it was an ordeal for them. Mm-hmm. So I agree with you. It was an ordeal for them. But I'll tell you the strange thing. It was like a homecoming for men when they read it. Mm-hmm. It was a homecoming. And I think, to answer your question, and I'll stop talking in a moment, I think that the great chasm between those two experiences is where we can begin some of our conversation, which is to be real about where nature has left us with regards to the male and female bodies, where nature has left us. And as a Vietnam vet said, and as Mankind Project says, it's really change one man at a time. And the constant invitation I make in the book is, look, you've got to bring this conversation down to yourself. We can't wait for things to change out there. The invitation is for one man at a time to begin to bring these awarenesses home in himself. And that's where the change begins for himself, then with his woman partner, then in his family, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. So I hope I've answered some of your question. I want to reiterate the biological nature of things. You're right, women are exhausted. Women are exhausted. And the business side of what you're talking about in the magazines is such low-hanging fruit. Mm-hmm. It's such low-hanging fruit that it's one of the predicaments that I identify in the book. It's something that keeps tugging us back, both men and women, into the same old mundane conversation, because biology, to some degree, will agree with that conversation. But the question is, where can our consciousness, which is a Goldilocks moment of opportunity here now, I think, en masse, where can our consciousness transport us to out of this mundane sex conversation? And that's something I hope I've offered as a starter.
You know, it's to build on what you spoke, Paul, it's been such a small conversation. You know, the whole conversation around sex is reduced to humor or objectification or many other things. And I want to go back to, you touch in the book about the initiatory process, which I think is a great model for many different endeavors as human beings. It goes far beyond sexuality as well, but it fits particularly well here. Yeah. There's a separation from what's familiar, a descent, basically, I don't know where this is going, but I'm going. An ordeal where we face our limitations or our past or many other things. And I've long felt the most neglected part in our world culture of that initiatory process is also the most important. It's what did you learn and how will we all benefit?
The gift we bring back.
Challenged in that way by other men, by women, doesn't make any difference. But the inquiry begins to erode the secret and the shame around sexuality as well. Yeah. What did you learn and how will we all benefit? And sitting in men's groups, and there was a premise that I put when we talk about sexuality. If you had a 15-year-old sitting in front of you and you wanted to share something that you've learned about sex from your own life, what would it be? That's the return. The return is being informed in a broader sense than what popular culture has allowed us to do. And our shame, shyness, reserve, whatever, has compounded it too. But it's okay to talk about sex if you're joking around. or admiring or questing. But to talk about the real ramifications, case in point, my thing about having 2 children and not participating, that's a bit deeper and a real human regret that younger men would be wise to take on board whatever they end up doing.
Yeah.
So
The whole notion of our history with sexuality is, well, with being human, is a repeat of the initiation process, no matter how old you are, whether it's taking on a new job or getting an education or something as complex as our sexuality. It's best to get to know that template because it shows up every place.
Yeah. Spot on, Snake.
So let me just, I just wanted to kind of develop on what's being said, but once again, I want to be a little more controversial, which is often my position, which is where is the interface? And yeah, I suppose this is a very clear question. Where is the interface between male sexuality and religion as we know it today? Because that feels like, and I don't know whether you've written about that, Paul, but when I listen to you both, and I think about, the clients I work with who are essentially very, very angry men, and of course, very, very angry women, there is something about how women punish men by depriving them of sex. And I know it's a generalization in the same way as men would punish women by depriving them of sex. But is it depriving them of sex, or is it depriving them of connection and intimacy? Because as I listen to you, and by the way, I'm holding the strand of religion, but I'm just on a roll for the moment, so stay with me. But as I start to basically make more sense of both conversations, and I see it within the context of my client group, what's appearing for me, and I don't know whether this is accurate, so it's obviously it's a curiosity and question for me, which is around when you talk about intimacy, whether it's emotional intimacy or sexual intimacy, where does connection come into this? That's the first question. Then I think about a cousin of mine who wrote an article about her having her first orgasm at the age of 42, which I think is very brave, but she has a background in Tantra. And, the kind of questions and the subject that we're exploring now is, what is the impact that it's having on women? So if I can just develop on that. One is, what is the role of religion? That's the first question. What is the role of intimacy - connection - sexuality? What is the role of women, and how does our inability to meet a woman in the way they need to be met shape who both they are, who their children are, and who we are as men? And there is something to be said about, you mentioned this book, The Male Brain and the Female Brain. Well, I started to read The Male Brain, and her ability to describe us men, and I want to include myself, was so darn accurate that I found it quite shocking and embarrassing, but at the same time quite excited, simply because it's written by a woman. So then it raises the question, I wonder whether a woman who is interested in the areas that you're interested in with your own background and history would write the same or a similar book. And if she wasn't writing the same or a similar book, what kind of book would she be writing?
Mike, you're asking so many good questions.
Sorry, I can't help myself.
Phenomenal. Snake, do you want to talk about religion? I'll just say a very brief word about religion. I do touch on it in the book. I touch on it to the degree that the men's narratives touch on it. And I would say across the board, most religions have separated ourselves from our bodies. And that fracture is very painful for a lot of men. and have a significant judgment around, sex before marriage and self-pleasuring, and exploration. And I think that there is some deep wounding that happens to us early on, to the degree that many people who show up in the therapeutic space are coming to undo and unknot those early aspects of themselves that have become knotted up. And I'll hand it over to you, Snake.
Yeah, I'm of two minds with that, because on one hand, in a perfect world, religion should give us a template for ethical behavior, but we don't live in a perfect world. And so I've long thought that the structures around sexuality are more about control, in not necessarily a generous sort of way, but rather you want to control an individual. There is no more powerful place to control a man than through his sexuality. And so I'm not big on, malicious actions on behalf of religion, but unfortunately it strays in the direction of control rather than a template for ethical life. And again, it depends on the individual and the practitioner around that too, but I see both in play in the world. On one hand, here's a model for how to behave and get through life. And on the other hand, but don't do that. And the shame and fear and judgment that gets woven into that erodes the power of that spiritual belief, I think, to a certain degree too. I find it somewhat ironic that, that connection to spirit expressed through sexuality doesn't even come into the scriptures in any particular way, and it's the highway.
Yeah.
The other part, Michael, you go, what would a woman write? I've spoken with enough women, friends, clients over the years, that there's an awful lot of secret for girls growing up as well. This whole topic of sexuality inhibited in a man's world is equally inhibited in the feminine world. So, as a human population across the globe, there are so many different influences to interfere and insert between our sexuality and ourselves. There's a great book out years ago, The History of Sex. And one of the things I found fascinating about that book is how many different templates there are for a sexual structure within a culture. There's some that are matriarchies, some that are patriarchies. And, I couple that with my own experience in that when it comes to sex, there's something out there for everybody. And I've kind of gotten past being surprised by that too. It's a wide range of personal preferences and how you form them. It's a huge topic. And I'm sure the same is true for women.
Yeah, I tell you, it kind of raises some interesting questions, because when I think about sex within the context of a religious framework, whatever that religion is, it's not about pleasure. It's about the recreation, not the recreation, the recreation of the human being. So if I think about the selfish gene by Hawkins, it's a biological impetus, it's a biological drive. Mm-hmm. And so, just coming back to some of the things you said, Paul, it feels that for so many of us, and that includes myself, my perspective and my view of intimacy and sexuality has been shaped by my own Jewish background. And that image that I observed when I was in Israel, and I'd heard about it when I lived in South Africa, there's the sheets that were hung out after having been washed to dry on those ropes and those strings, all over Israel with the little hole in the middle where, sex was all about giving birth to future generations. It was like a nachas to God. It was a celebration of God. There was no pleasure involved. I mean, I don't even know if those women have orgasm, even if the men have orgasm. And then, of course, if you think about some of the stories I've heard about how many of these Hasidic Jews are allowed to visit prostitutes. And it's kind of okay in the religion. So, when I listen to the conversation, and as I kind of try and unravel it in my own ecosphere, it's just like, God, it's so darn confusing. And
it is.
It's confusing for me. I'm just thinking about how confusing it must be for other men, and of course for other women.
And I think that's why we don't speak about it too. It's not something you can go in and just dip a toe in. It's almost like you look at people who are doing, personal examination. The biggest fear that you hear over and over again is, I'm not going to open that box. I'll never get it closed again. And I think sexuality falls into that category too. And so it's far easier and culturally acceptable to keep it superficial. And in that place, we remain ignorant by not sharing our experience with one another.
But then what you're also suggesting, Snake, is that what Paul has done is actually opened up a can of worms.
Yes, and a very important can of worms. I believe that, the different areas that Paul has chosen to focus on gives you a window into biology, gives you a window into relationship, gives you a window into so many different aspects of sexuality. It's a conversation starter. It's not a conversation ender. It's I think what Paul spoke in the very beginning of this conversation about the outside world just didn't make sense for him. He'd experienced a certain amount of openness and dialogue as a child growing up and did not find that out there in the world. And apparently that irritated you enough to write the book.
It certainly did.
Is that your experience, Paul?
Yeah. I just, I don't know if the story of the prince without any clothes resonates, but it was as if a chapter of our becoming was missing out of all of the great work that I'd experienced in the men's work and in Chinese medicine and psychology. It was like, well, where's the conversation about what it costs to get loaded with testosterone? Where's the conversation about what it costs to have this great optical visibility of seeing sexual opportunity? Where's the conversation? And how does that bleed into our consciousness and our executive functioning as men? And really, Snake, you're correct in saying the book is not meant as an answer. It's really, I hope, the first generation in a lot of different conversations where men and women will say, well, here's something interesting, and then just think about it for 6 months, and then go back and look somewhere else in the book. I thought that these topics that I touched on would be important fire starters for relationships and for men who wanted to get into the next level of their evolution and out of the mainstream mundanity into what I call the extraordinary. And as you said earlier, Snake, to bring the beginner's mind with, because my goodness, we know how inundated we are with sexual messages and pictures of all sorts of things. So Snake, Mike, I want to respond to your question about women and sexual withholding and intimacy. I'd like to propose that the heterosexual relationship deserves a lot more respect than it's given. And the reason I say that is because we're meeting an entirely different being when we connect with a woman. And if you read Luann Brisendine's book, and you said you really connected into this description of man, well, if you read her book on women, you would say, well, geez, how do these two actually get together, and how do they stay together? And so I think that the long, respectful, intimate, compassionate, communicative, heterosexual relationship really deserves a lot of honor, and much more than society tends to give it, because we're different sex sensate bodies. We've got different windows that we see the world through. We have different emotional bodies. And yet, because it's called heteronormative, it seems like, well, we shouldn't be having any problem with this. Like, we've seen the movies, they're 90 minutes long and they all end pretty happily. So how come we can't solve these complexities? But I think that they're to be received with the deepest bow. The other thing I'll say is that as heterosexual men, I think that we're green carded into the world. And I say that when I compare our journey to our gay brothers and sisters. Our gay brothers and sisters need, on some level, to figure out how do they marry their humanity and their sexuality? How will their family view their sexuality? How will the world view their sexuality? How do they navigate? We come out into the world. We have a red carpet. We are part of the reproductioneers, as I say in the book. We're the ones that are going to have the babies, and et cetera, et cetera. And up until not so long ago, the gay community was not welcomed in a similar fashion out into the world. So there's no push force for us to really figure out, as you said, Mike, what does it mean to be a sexual human being? And I think our great gay brothers and sisters really don't have to, but I think they ask that question because it's a matter of life and death for them. Mm. You know what the biggest question we ask is, at a young age, how do we get more sex? Mm-hmm. Generally speaking. I'm
still asking that question.
Fair enough, Mike. Fair enough. So I'll end off that thought by saying this concept of seeking to understand each other as men and women requires that we deeply understand ourselves first, which means our biological selves, our emotional selves, our sexual selves. And when we have a format to explain to our partner what we're feeling, what we're sensing, and exchange that, the level of intimacy and trust and the extraordinary begins to extrapolate significantly. If we try and live in the mundane around sex and penetration and orgasm, and how many times did we have sex, and how many times did you orgasm, how many times did our, it's a ticket. It's a ticket to a difficult place. I'll just leave it at that.
Look,
it's exhausting.
It's exhausting.
I want to speak to that. And I think this is because I've been struggling with my reaction to not necessarily the conversation we're having now, because the conversation now feels like an extraordinary education. But one of the things I noticed when I was thinking about this conversation this morning, and some of the stuff that Manuela sent me on the what was the prediction?
The predicament of heterosexual male sexuality. Yeah.
I think that just in terms of my own process, my own journey, there is something to be said about where I am at the age of 64, not at the age of 24 or even 55, but at 64, where sex without intimacy, I'm not even interested in. Very, very far from it. Historically, it was a different conversation. I was chasing the orgasm. But I think there's also something to be said that even though, I've done a huge amount of personal development work on myself, and I have a strong sense of who I am in the world. And of course, I have a strong sense of the opposite sex. And, historically, I would joke about it, the Facebook image where the books, the study of the book of women is about, it's like hundreds of chapters, millions of pages, where books on men is just like, a very small book with maybe 300-400 pages. That's even if that much. But actually what I've realized is that actually we are as complex as women are. And, I've said even in my private practice, how to keep a man satisfied, how to keep a man happy. All you got to do is fuck him and feed him. That's it. That's all they're interested in. But what you're raising here are fundamental questions. Because I do think there's something to be said about our biology, our emotionality, and our sexuality. And it's the sexuality that's never been addressed. Mm-hmm. When I trained as a therapist, sexuality wasn't dealt with, and it's a big conversation. Shame wasn't dealt with, and neither was anger dealt with. So it feels like this book that you've written, and I've said this to you before, for me, it's so academic that it's so dry that it doesn't touch me in the way that a book which is written for the lay person. But just having this conversation, and I hope that listeners who are hearing this conversation, I hope it creates interest and fascination to read the book, or at least try reading the book, even however academic it is. Mm-hmm. That's one part of it. The other part of it is that what I realized in terms of my own reaction that I was having this morning before coming online and thinking about it was that having my perception of sexuality challenged in the way we're challenging male sexuality right now, because I'm really comfortable with the way that I do my own male sexuality. I think the only difference is that I'm also evolved. I'm sufficiently evolved to understand that's just one aspect of who I am in the world. It's not all of who I am in the world. But certainly when I was a young man, it was about how many women I'd slept with, how many orgasms I've had, and how much fun I've had with the opposite sex, without thinking of how it affected and how it impacted them. I mean, of course, I talk about objectification of women. I still objectify women. I'm conditioned to do so, but I know that's not all they represent for me, and I know that's not all I represent for them. And I'll leave you with that.
It's interesting. What's on my mind now is the cruelest joke of all. And Robert Moore, the Jungian analyst, wrote at one point that men and women move through the archetypes in a different order. That, boys are full on into the warrior until their 20s and developing that archetype, where women are in the lover. Men and women meet in their 20s and 30s in the magician, and it's creating a house, security, family, that type of thing. But then the cruel trick is men enter into the lover in their mid to late 40s and 50s and start questioning, well, what's the purpose? What's the meaning? And all those questions come right out of that lover archetype. Whereas women oftentimes are in a place of, in their 40s and 50s, of, I've had enough, what about me? And that's warrior. So could there be communication that's valuable for men to coach women around the warrior and women to coach men around the lover? I mean, that's a huge conversation right there. Obviously the ultimate goal is some form of integration of those. And again, it's archetypes, it's highly intellectual. But I've seen that pattern play out, and I've seen it in myself. At 70, it isn't that sex isn't appealing, but I'm no longer howling at the moon like I was when I was 15, and it's a relief. It's a relief to not be driven to that degree and crazy behavior.
Yeah, I love that, Snake. I love the missing that you speak to with regards to the archetypes and the cruel trick or the joke of the heterosexual relationship. It's another example. It's another example of what we take for granted in gay relationships, because the familiarity that men and women who are together with each other experience cannot be taken as nothing. It's profound. It's profound, and it's incredibly oiling in the relationship. I am not suggesting for a second that gay relationships are without complexity. That would be ridiculous. However, the complexity of the heterosexual relationship, by virtue of having given it the name heteronormative, has cost us, it's not even an amnesia, it's cost us a library of information that we could have gathered through the inquisitiveness and the inquiry around how to bring these two very different emotional and biological beings together in the first place. But then, as you're referring to, as they move, if they're lucky enough to move through the years, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, even same partnership or different partnership. So I like what you're saying, and I feel strongly that that's a very elevated, certainly something different than society offers us as a conversation. But again, it does require the men and the women to really know and be willing to know themselves biologically, emotionally, and sexually at those different stages of their life cycle.
No. Instead, we end up with this adversarial thing where there's an overlay of the culture. I think back years ago, I did a workshop. It was men and women together, maybe 50 people all together. And I separated the men and the women and instructed both sides. What I want you to do is what you would like the other gender to hear. But what I want you to do is funnel it through one person. So in other words, choose someone to represent the masculine, choose someone to represent the feminine, and agree on what one thing you want the other one to hear. And then we'll bring those two surrogates together and have them speak to one another. What I found fascinating was the women picked the most vivacious, lovely woman to represent them, and the men chose the oldest man. And I've never been able to figure out if it was because he was expendable or actually wise. But it was such an interesting dynamic, because even invited into a conversation like that, we still have these gender biases that put us to the advantage in some way or another. And it's subtle and profound at the same time. Yeah, it was almost like, the old man that they picked out to represent them, the men did. I've often wondered, was it because he was expendable or because no one would hurt him? And same with the women. What's not to love about this woman standing out and speaking a message? It worked to both genders' advantage in a real unconscious sort of way. And it could be the conversation that the book suggests around broadening this conversation in a big way. I mean, I mentioned a couple things that I've stumbled and kind of pondered around, but there's got to be a million more.
I think the leftovers of what many women talk about around patriarchy and misogyny, the exhaustion, the objectification, and those particular messages that they've gleaned from society do keep a lot of women out of the conversation and their willingness to be engaged in the conversation, particularly women who've reached their 50s and 60s. But again, I'll come back to this concept which I refer to in the book, Stewio, seeking to understand each other. It's really born out of a place of curiosity instead of adversity. curiosity instead of adversity. And again, it begins with the curiosity of the self, but then to really become curious about who is this person living in the man's body, and what is it about what he brings, and how can I meet him as a woman, and how can I express myself in a way that is authentic and true for me and where I'm at. And I just think that it feels as if there's too much thread taken from the garment of the mundanity of what society offers us in magazines and columns, etc., where people are they're advised in a way that continues the old computer game instead of switching the machine off and stepping into something that we don't even know what it looks like because we don't really see it around very much. And that's kind of the invitation and the map in the book. It's like going on a holiday. I don't know what I'm going to experience, or having a yoga. I don't know how I'm going to feel after the class, but I'm willing to take this journey, because what I'm experiencing now, or what we're experiencing now, we kind of had enough of.
Yeah.
So what else is there?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it bears noting too that although we speak and make dividing lines around gender, there are crossovers. Yeah. I've known women who have far more of a male stereotypical sexuality, and men who have far more of a feminine sexuality. So despite the biology and the brain chemistry, there are crossovers as well that fall into one category or another, or move back and forth.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Snake, because it is dangerous to generalize.
Yeah.
The best we can do is talk about tendencies. And as you say, yes, to recognize that there are men and women in both camps, and there are crossovers. So thank you for saying that.
Gentlemen, I'm aware of time. I don't know how much we want to discuss the subject, whether we want to go deeper into it, whether we need to come back, reflect on what's been discussed, and maybe do a part 2 of this conversation, which I think would be really interesting.
Good, Mike. Yeah.
But is there anything else we want to add to what we've discussing here? I know that I'm certainly compelled to read the book now that I understand much more about my reaction to the book, and also my reaction to it being as academic as it is. So I'm going to make a commitment to myself to certainly dig deep into it. And
I think that's somewhat of a misread too, because yes, Paul states a lot of studies, a lot of research, but it also is very personal in terms of the stories that are shared, and particularly the exercises that you offer up lead a person into this sense of inquiry. And as you say, open the conversation, and it's on each one of us to reflect on it and see how it fits with us. Yeah. So it's a piece of words, Paul.
Thank you.
Just developing what you're saying. So I'll have I'll make an effort, and I'll do the work, and I'll commit myself to reading the book. And I hope that listeners who have listened to this conversation have found it rich and interesting, and even controversial, because it certainly is groundbreaking as far as I'm concerned. And it feels like this conversation is so rich and so meaningful. So thanks, Paulie.
Thank you, Mike.
I appreciate the time and the effort you put into writing the book, and of course the time and effort you put into having the conversation with myself and Snake.
Thank you. This is a conversation that could go into several different episodes. It's a good place to leave it right now, but I noticed too that we haven't even mentioned the name of the book. That'd probably be smart.
Go ahead, Snake.
It's Sex Ed, and it's available on Amazon, and it's written by Paul Abramowitz. It's commit to it. It's worthwhile.
Thank you, Snake. I'm going to restate the name of the book. It's actually Sexed, SEXED, hardwired by nature, evolving by choice. It is written in a rather confusing way. It is meant to read as one word. Yes, sex ed. It's also meant to read as seed, SEED, if you take the X out of it. But thank you. It's been a real thrill to be with you both, and I'm so grateful to both of you for my own development and introduction into a lot of great men's work as well. And thank you, Snake, for taking the time to read the book. That's very meaningful, and Mike for committing as well.
That was Mike Fisher and Snake Bloomstrand, even from BAAM, talking to Paul Abramowitz, writer of the new book about heterosexual male sexuality, Sexed, available right now on Amazon. The Wisdom Track is back in February. You can sign up to our newsletter over at angermanage.co.uk for all the details. And you can follow us now over on Instagram at angermanagement.uk. Whatever channel you're listening on, please hit the like button and subscribe if you can. These things are really important for getting these talks out there to other people who may benefit from them. You can find other episodes of the Wisdom Track, including our recent Emotional Resilience special, over at Apple Podcasts under the Wisdom Track, and you can find us at YouTube as well, again, under the Wisdom Track. BAAM's world-beating anger management courses, as seen in the Sunday Times, The Face, current issue out now, Adele on the cover, Stylist magazine, and many more august publications, begin again in March. The introductory evening, Introduction to Anger Management, that is from BAAM, is on Thursday, the 10th of March at 7 p.m. Our 10 installment weekly course begins again on Tuesday, the 15th of March, and we have an in-person weekend course happening just outside London from the 25th, 26th, and 27th of March. Head over to angermanage.co.uk for more details. From everyone at the British Association of Anger Management, thank you very much indeed for listening, and see you next month.